Welcome to the overview video of Chapter 1 and Constitutional Democracy in AP US Government and Politics with Mr. Rodman. I'm here to take you through an overview of the entire chapter. Are you ready? Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. No. Hopefully you'll find this helpful. And again, if you have additional questions or need help, please be sure to reach out to me via email and let me know so that I can put those resources in your hands. All right, here we go. Chapter 1, looking at a constitutional democracy. We're going to look at what government is, what democracy is, this constitutional experiment that the founders and framers took place, what happened in 1787 at this Constitutional Convention, and what were they going to take a look at in terms of adoption or not adopt, and what ideas did they leave on the table or decide, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't such a great idea. So we start with this idea of government by the people requires faith in our common enterprise, belief in capacity of people for self-government, but also a healthy dose of skepticism. This is not a perfect experiment. It is just that, an experiment. And so we know that it's going to evolve. It's going to take shape. There's going to be things that work well. There are going to be things we're going to need to revise along the way. And that is the more perfect union that the founders and framers were striving for here. But they knew it wasn't going to be perfect. They knew it was going to be a work in progress, and it was going to require constant attention in order to make that happen. So, government by the people. First of all, we need people to run for office. Without individuals that are voting and without individuals that are campaigning, we don't have that constitutional democracy we're talking about here. Second, people have to pay attention. They have to be involved. The apathetic voter, the person that stays home to wash the cat, as I mentioned in class, or making any excuse, which essentially what wash the cat is, making any excuse to stay home rather than vote or pay attention to elections is essentially what we do not want. We don't want people to stay home. We want people to get active. We want people to exercise their voices and make their voices heard. And whether that's running for office or supporting a candidate or writing a letter or protesting or criticizing what the government has done or is doing is going to be vital to a democracy, and that is really critical. Now, also keep in mind, it's that caution, that skepticism, that we can't just blindly follow what our leaders tell us. We want to do the old trust but verify approach, and that is we want to hold our elected leaders accountable. We want them to, again, we are consent of the governed, so they have been elected by us to pass laws over us that then we have to follow. But it also means that if we don't like what they're doing, we can throw them out in the next election. We can vote for somebody else. And that's the caution. That's the skepticism that Dr. Magleby talks about in the book here in terms of making sure that the government is of, by, and for the will of the people. And that's really key. So constitutional democracy is this idea that we have representatives that run the government. They are elected by the people in free and fair elections. The power is not in any one person, but it is fragmented. It is split. It is split among, as we will see, separate powers between legislative, executive, and judicial. It's also split between national, state, and local government. Now, the Constitution only refers to national and state government, local government kind of being created by the states. But the idea is it is in the hands of the states. It is national and state, and ultimately thinking that local government would have a role that will fragment this government even further. Is it perfect? Is it realistic? It depends. We know it's not perfect. We know there are always going to be changes that need to be made. But is it realistic? The idea is if we are vigilant, if we are paying attention to what they're trying to what the elected officials are trying to pass, and we make our voices heard, the idea is they will be held accountable. And that is part of the constitutional democracy that the founders and framers set up. Now, a direct democracy is when everybody votes on everything. So can you imagine everybody coming together, 330 million people coming together to vote on every piece of legislation that's coming before Congress, or every act or presidential order that's passed by President Trump, or every Supreme Court ruling or ruling by courts. Obviously, that wouldn't work in a democracy of 330 million people. We need a little more than that. And the key here is that we need to be vigilant, but not that vigilant. We're not going to be voting entirely in this realm. We need to represent. We need to be a part of a representative democracy in which we're voting to elect our leaders, who then pass laws over us that we then have to follow. Congressman Jamie Raskin of the 8th District in Maryland is a member of Congress. He also served in the state Senate and served in the House of Delegates in the Maryland State House. But he is representing the 8th District, which includes a lot of the Walter Johnson District, and he is our representative. So we vote to elect him, or if you don't like his policies and his politics, you can vote for someone else. But the idea is that when we elect whoever we elect in that role, they then have been elected to pass laws over us that we then have to follow. And that is the consent of the governed. The idea that we give our consent to those elected officials to pass laws over us that we then have to follow. That's representative democracy. The idea is we're voting, but we're also being represented in that voting so that they can then spend their time focused on the most important issues that they feel are important to their voters back home, their constituents, or their voters here right in the 8th District. And or the 6th District, April McLean Delaney, also in the 6th District in Maryland, if you're in that district. Not as many people are in that district, but the majority probably in the 8th District there. Okay, so what are some state-level direct democracy policies we see today? A direct primary is a great example of direct democracy. We are basically voting for people that will appear on the ballot for a particular political party, depending on which party you're in. Now, Maryland has a closed primary, which means you have to be a member of the political party in order to vote in their primary. But you're voting directly for those candidates that will then appear on the ballot in November. And so that is a great example of direct democracy. An initiative even more so, if you've ever been outside a grocery store and you've been asked to sign a petition, that's the initiative that you see there. And, you know, they have the clipboard and they ask for, are you a registered voter? Can you sign our petition? That's a great idea of direct democracy. They meet a certain number of signatures of registered voters in the district or in the state. They can have that put on referendum, which is whatever they're talking about would appear on the ballot. So you see this a lot in referenda, this idea of Prop 1 or Proposition 1 or 2 or 3, and it can get rather long if you have too many of those. But the idea is usually they pass. Usually they've got enough signatures to get on the ballot, and most times they will pass. There are unique situations in which they don't. But that's a great example of direct democracy where we are actually voting on the legislation. We're voting on the policies that we want to pass. And so you see that in the state of Maryland. That is a great example of direct democracy. And then recall, we don't have that in the state of Maryland, but there are other states that do. We have seen that in California, for instance, where Governor Gray Davis, during there was an electricity crisis, and he was recalled, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, was actually elected through that recall election because of the state recalling their governor. And that's a great example of direct democracy. We don't have that here in the state of Maryland, but a lot of states do, and that is another example of direct democracy. Okay, so moving on, we have 3 models that we focus on here in our constitutional democracy. In terms of our representative democracy that we talked about, this idea of Congressman Raskin representing us or Congressman McLean Delaney representing us. And we see these kind of in 3 different ways. So 3 models here include participatory democracy. This is the idea of that direct participation. So this is where we are voting. We are voting on our elected leaders. We're voting on referenda. We're voting by signing a petition. That's very participatory in nature. Pluralist democracy is when we see groups, outside groups or other groups, even political parties to some extent, that are trying to influence the process in order to get people to vote or sign a petition or vote yes or no on a referendum. That is a good example of all of those groups that are taking shape and trying to get people to weigh in on those, to vote one way or another. And that's the pluralist democracy, where groups or special interests, Madison called them factions, they take place. And that is the very pluralist in nature, the idea of plural groups, plural factions that are taking place. And then we have the elite democracy, which we do see when the wealthy, the people with significant power or significant voting strength, usually in business or in highly educated people that have a role in that respect. We've seen a lot with Elon Musk, Doge. We've been hearing about in the Trump administration when they came into office in January. Now that's kind of taken a step back as Elon Musk has kind of gone back into his businesses. But DOE's, the Department of Government Efficiency, is a great example of elite democracy where people are kind of stepping in. The president's appointing these individuals who are really good at business in order to really shape policies within the government. And again, whether you agree with their policies or not, we're really not here to debate that. The idea is that he looks to them as leaders in their fields, and as a result of that, the president wants them to weigh in on policies that the government is doing in order to make it more efficient. And so that's where we see a lot of elite democracy. And that's going all the way back to, the Great Society with Lyndon Johnson, with FDR and the New Deal. We see a lot of business leaders or wealthy individuals that were brought in, or at least weighing in, having the ear of elected officials in order to influence policy. We see that time and again. That's very much the elite democracy at work. So those three models, definitely ones you need to know. Those are on the AP exam as well. But that's kind of how they break down. And I think they're pretty easy to distinguish between the three. Participatory is what we're doing. We're participating. Pluralist is where many groups, the plural of groups, are out there, the special interests or the outside groups that are influencing policy. And then the elite, the idea of the wealthy or the business leaders, those with significant influence that can influence policy and have the ear of elected officials to do that as well. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about a couple other forms of government that Magleby mentions here in the text in Chapter 1, and that is autocracy. Think of it this way, the differences between autocracy, oligarchy, and democracy, which we've been talking about, many people voting in many elections, that's very much democratic. Oligarchy is when you have a small group of people that basically make all the decisions. And then you have autocracy, which is the autocratic form of government, and that is where one person basically calls all the shots. Now, that is very efficient and very quick, the idea of one person calling all the shots. But there's not a whole lot of representation by the people in making those decisions, which is why we tend to see that in more totalitarian or militaristic forms of government in the autocratic sense. Oligarchy, a small group of people that are making decisions, and we've seen this with like the Central Committee in China or the oligarchy, the business leaders and members of the Russian government would be a good example there. And those are very different because, again, the people aren't weighing in. The people aren't really able to influence who's in charge. And in a democracy, the idea is that the people have a right to vote. They have a right to influence that. And with primaries, we can choose who our candidates are going to be to run in those elections. Okay, a couple of other forms of government, and this kind of ties into what we were just talking about. So authoritarian government or autocracy would be very much the idea of absolute government or totalitarian dictatorship. And again, we've seen these time and again. Constitutional democracy, though, is the idea that it is based on either governing documents or a constitution of documents that basically create how the government's going to run, how it's going to operate, what it's going to look like, feel like, and when policy goes through that, how that operation works. And that's really what we're going to study in this course, is the idea of how does a bill become a law? How does the president's executive orders have the full force of law? How does a Supreme Court ruling have the full force of law in terms of being the law of the land? And that is really where we're going to spend a lot more time. But it's important to know distinctions in terms of differences between these types of governments. Now, the framers, as you can imagine, didn't really want a direct democracy. And depending on who you asked, some of them didn't see, people as being educated enough to make. Remember, a lot of them were farmers that back then that voted, and so they saw a role for them in like voting for House members and state representatives, that sort of thing. Less so with the Senate. They said educated individuals needed to make those decisions. So it's really the state legislature that would choose a U.S. senator to represent them in Washington. And the same thing with the president, an electoral college of people that were chosen by state legislatures to basically choose who the next president was going to be. So there's many limits to the direct democracy that we see taking place here. Now, that has pros and cons. Obviously, the more you take away direct democracy and the will of the people, the more you have people complaining that you're not really following the will of the people and that you're kind of doing your own thing. And so depending on how that policy shapes out, you may have a problem with your constituents, your voters back home. And so sometimes what they will find is that people will want to throw them out and they'll elect someone else. And so we see this when the House and the Senate are basically overtaken by Democrats or Republicans or vice versa. And this is basically the will of the people deciding that, hey, we want a change in government. We want a change in leadership. And we see this with the vote for the presidency, when people are voting, and ultimately the Electoral College is voting to select the president. But the idea is that people vote for change, and especially if times aren't good, and they don't have a job, or they're having trouble making ends meet, that's when you're seeing a lot more change on the horizon because people are upset and they're voting on those emotions, on those upsetting emotions. So the framers really decided on a representative democracy for a number of reasons, and this was because they really saw a role with voters, many of them being farmers, a role with them to vote in elections and support the candidates that they're interested in, but also wanting an educated elite to make decisions at higher levels like Senate and the U.S. In the U.S. presidency or the Electoral College. And we'll get into more of that when we get to Unit 2. But that's important to note here because a lot of times there's misconceptions about, well, the framers wanted a democracy of, by, and for the people. Well, they did, and they certainly did, but not entirely. And there's lots of ways as we start to delve into the Constitution in the next chapter that we'll start to see that taking shape, in that there were areas that they didn't want all of the people voting because they were worried about them being uneducated voters and not as informed as the educated elite, and they wanted the educated elite to make good decisions on behalf of Americans in order to make people better off, and that is significant. So the idea, and we talked about this when we did the consensogram stickers around the room, what values in our democracy do we value as a culture? We value liberty. We talked about that idea of liberty. Now, how that looks when it comes to legislating liberty What kind of freedom are you talking about? We all value freedom. We all value liberty and individualism, that equality of opportunity. But what does that look like when it comes to legislation? When it comes to looking at what types of benefits should unemployed people get? What types of benefits should retirees get? What types of benefits should we get when we pay for transportation? What types of roads and highways do we deserve? And popular sovereignty tying into that, the voting and the will of the people is really varied depending on the types of elected officials we're talking about. But if we're looking at the House of Representatives, for instance, the founders and framers really wanted the people to elect those individuals that would serve in the House of Representatives. They wanted it to be, and they call it the People's House for a reason. They wanted it to be a branch of government that was of by and for the people and elected by the people. The Senate, the presidency, not so much. And we'll get into more of that later. Okay, so what processes do we see in a democracy? Well, we see free and fair elections are important. We see the idea of majority rule, or even plurality. What's the difference? Plurality is the idea that they won the most votes, but they didn't win a majority of the votes. So if there's more than one candidate running, more than two candidates running, you're going to see a plurality. A lot of times they win a plurality of votes, but not necessarily a majority. Bill Clinton did this in 1992. He didn't win the majority of the vote in 1992, but he did win a plurality of the vote and ultimately the Electoral College and won the election. Free expression is an important part of this. People's ability to protest, to exercise their voices, to petition the government for a redress of grievances. These are all part of what makes a democracy work. Being able to come together and assemble and protest as a result of things that you think are wrong and things that are problematic in our government and that need to be changed. This is a part of that process. Voting, obviously, the most important, but because without that, you don't have changes in policy if you're not legislating them. But the idea is that this is a part of democracy too. This is a part of that constitutional democracy because without it, being able to raise your voices, express your points of view, and hold those free and fair elections, your democracy is not free and fair. It is not representative of the people, and that is definitely of concern in that respect. Okay, we need to move on, but I want to talk about 5 political structures that are in democracy. In the constitutional democracy that we have. And we'll go into more details on these a little later, but I just want to introduce them here. Federalism is the idea of sharing power. Think of it as a handshake between national and state government. Notice, as I said earlier, there's no local government involved because it's really the power is in the hands of the states when it comes to local government. But the states can give local government significant power, but they can also take it away. So that's federalism. We talk a lot more about that in Chapter 3. Separation of powers is the idea that different branches have different roles and responsibilities. The executive branch basically enforces the laws. The legislative branch makes those laws, and the judicial branch interprets those laws. Very distinct responsibilities or roles that they have in carrying out the will of the people. Bicameral is the idea of our legislative branch being 2 chambers, and the idea there is that I think every state except Nebraska has a bicameral legislature, Nebraska having a unicameral one, and that is set up of 2 chambers, an upper chamber and a lower chamber, fashioned after the legislative body that the founders and framers knew at the time, which was in Great Britain, having a House of Lords and a House of Commons. We have a House of Representatives, which is known as the People's House, and then we have a Senate, which is kind of that upper chamber. They serve longer terms, and they represent more the entire state versus a House district that can represent a portion of a state in most cases, and they are only running for election every 6 years versus the House, which is running every 2. And again, we'll get into more of those details later. Checks and balances, also another one that we're going to see, is the idea that each of these branches that we talked about in separation of powers can check or balance the other one so that not one branch gets too much power. Yes, the legislative branch can make the laws, but the president can veto those laws. And the legislature can actually override that veto. And if they do, and the judicial branch can step in and say, hey, that law is unconstitutional. Or they can say, hey, the president's executive order, that's unconstitutional too. So there is a check and balance system in place between these three branches. And again, we'll talk more about that later. But the idea is it is impacting our constitutional democracy because it's making sure that no power is in the hand of any one individual. It's in the hands of three separate and distinct branches of government that have roles and responsibilities or powers that can be checked by the others. And lastly, we have the Bill of Rights. And we can thank George Mason, and we can thank the Anti-Federalists for a lot of this. James Madison coming up with and trying to assuage the Anti-Federalists that were worried about a strong central government becoming too strong. And so the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, essentially being the solution to that problem. But the Bill of Rights is also a part of our democracy, ensuring those free and fair elections, ensuring that right to protest and assemble and petition, what we see in the First Amendment and the five freedoms of the First Amendment being so important there. So these help our constitutional democracy by allowing people to interact within it and seeing how the intricate process actually works. And that's what's really critical here. Okay, so human nature. When we get into this idea of how the framers were looking at human nature, they had done a lot of studying. They had looked at European philosophers. They had looked at the theories of influence in terms of how governments were shaped and formed before them. And they were taking notes. They were looking at best practices. They were looking at what worked and what didn't. And one thing that kept coming up was this idea of Thomas Hobbes that mankind was pretty brutal to each other. We saw a lot of religious wars that were being fought in the name of religion, in which many thousands, if not millions, of people died. And so people were pretty nasty to each other. This idea of dog eat dog kind of thing and the survival of the fittest is very Hobbesian in nature because of that. And so what we needed was government to protect us from other people and to serve in that security capacity. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness became life, liberty, and property because or property to the pursuit of happiness as part of that, because they were worried about people coming in and killing the people and taking their land, and nobody wanted that to happen. And so what we see is we have these natural rights. The founders and framers looking at these natural rights given to us by a higher power, some type of higher power, and beyond government. But yet we're going to give up some of that power in order to have a government that is then going to pass laws over us that we can live by. And so that's going, and that's giving us protection, that's giving us security to be able to sleep at night, kind of thing. And so this is very Lockean, coming from John Locke, but the idea that a social contract with government is going to help us to make sure that the natural rights that we have that are unalienable continue to exist and can be protected. And think about this in terms of the elite that were the founders and framers, right? They owned land. Many of them owned slaves. Many of them owned significant portions of land in their states and had significant influence in state legislators and legislation policy. And so they wanted government for the purpose of protecting what they had in a lot of cases and kind of keeping them where they are. But they also wanted government to be responsive to the needs of the people. And so this social contract that John Locke talked about was really about kind of looking at nature as a way to to ensure that we still had that life, liberty, and what we know as pursuit of happiness today, but estate was the idea that Locke gave us, would become property later on and then would be changed to the pursuit of happiness. But the idea was there's a social contract between government and the people, and that is that with this contract, the government is going to be there to protect you, to ensure these natural rights are protected. And with that, you're going to give government some power from the people to make sure that these laws are able to be carried out, that these policies are enshrined in your safety and security, so that you don't have to worry about someone coming in and taking all of your land or killing you and your family. And that is significant here. Now, Montesquieu was drawn upon, Madison looking to Montesquieu in writing the Constitution, because Montesquieu was really ahead of his time in looking at the idea of separate powers. And so we get the separation of powers influences really from Montesquieu, this idea that we're going to separate the different branches of government so that no branch becomes so powerful that the other branches can't make sure that we're keeping them in check. And so that's really important here, because those separate powers become the checks and balances that we see today in making sure that, hey, if a law is passed and the president doesn't like it, he can veto it. And if the Supreme Court doesn't like it, they can declare it unconstitutional. And different checks and balances like that. Like I said, we'll go into much more detail on that. But the idea of the separation of powers is that each role and responsibility of each branch is very different. And by doing that, we're also controlling those factions, those interest groups, those special interests that have the ear of the elected officials. We're also controlling the policy power that any one branch has to keep them from basically taking all of the power and using it against the will of the people. And Rousseau then says this is important because if the government does try to use it against the people, then we can break the social contract. What Locke gave us, we can break that contract, and free and fair elections is the way we do that. And so Madison wrote the Constitution with the idea that states would hold elections, and those elections would then determine who is in power next. And if you don't like those people, you can break that social contract, and you can elect new people to office that then you can that will then pass laws over you that you have to follow, the idea of the consent of the governed. So that social contract is important here because we can also break it. And we saw this with the French Revolution, right? I mean, they definitely broke the social contract there, created a whole new government based on it. But the importance there is that the power is still in the hands of the people. The people have the ability to elect new leaders or not elect new leaders if they don't want to. And that's the importance of the constitutional democracy. It's about putting the power in the hands of the people. Okay, so the social contract, as Jefferson shared with us, is the idea of protecting those natural rights. We see that throughout our government today. We see this changing throughout government as administrations change. We go from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. We go from a Democratic Congress to a Republican Congress, or from a Republican Congress to a Democratic Congress. And so we see those changes in policy take shape. And we saw this when the Trump administration switched to the Biden administration. And we'll see it again at the end of 4 years when the Trump administration and a new administration comes in. All of this is part of that constitutional democracy. All of this is part of that social contract that was set up under the founders and framers, the Jeffersons and the Madisons of the world. Now, they didn't start out with the Constitution, right? They started with the Articles of Confederation. But we could see pretty quickly that the Articles of Confederation had problems. A lot of problems. How many problems? Well, if you couldn't levy taxes, you couldn't pay an army. And if you couldn't pay an army, who's going to want to work in your army? So this is a problem under the Articles. You also couldn't require states to give the national government money. So you were basically hat in hand going state by state, asking them, basically begging them to give you money to run the national government. That was never going to work. They also can't regulate trade. They had to have unanimity in terms of being able to amend any of the articles. You had to have all 13 colonies on board in order to do that. You could see quickly this wasn't going to be successful because of the problems that we saw here with the Articles of Confederation. So there were post offices that could be established, and they were, but if they couldn't pay for themselves, the government had no money to continue to run them, and then you start to see the problems that the Articles of Confederation were starting to take shape. And this led to Shays' Rebellion. The idea of a recession in the economy taking place, businesses are closing, farmers are having trouble paying their mortgages, and so they're frustrated, they're mad as heck, they're not going to take it anymore, and so they decide to take it out on bankers. And so trying to put down this Shays' Rebellion was a real challenge because we had no national army or navy to do this. And so quickly, the founders and framers, and we can see in letters between Jefferson and Madison, that they're basically saying, hey, we got a problem here because we didn't anticipate this. And what happens if there's something even bigger than this? Now, ultimately, they did put down Shays' Rebellion, but it motivated them to say, hey, we need to take a closer look at this. We need to look at this Articles of Confederation and see if we can make some changes. That really was the motive. They wanted to make changes. They did not want to throw out the Articles entirely. So they called for a constitutional convention. And the idea was to fix the Articles of Confederation. They weren't planning on throwing the whole thing out. The problem was when they got into the edits and the amendments to the Articles, which needed unanimity. Every colony, every state needed to be on board. And what they found was, how are we ever going to do this if everybody has to agree? I mean, you can imagine 13 states with representatives from each of those states, and how horribly that was going to take them forever to even get close to that, and they're never going to be able to resolve it. So what did they do? They decided to throw the whole thing out and write a constitution, right? And so they decided we need to find some compromises where we can create a constitution that is going to represent all 13 of the states, and it is going to have a national government that has enough power to put down a Shays' Rebellion. And they're also looking through the windshield and seeing what's ahead on the road. They're also seeing, hey, we're not talking about this slavery issue, but slavery is going to be a problem down the road, and somebody's going to have to deal with it. And if the national government has no power, they're never going to be able to resolve this issue. So they are thinking ahead to other problems down the road that whoever's in charge is going to have to resolve. And so they found some of these compromises are going to have to take place in the Constitution that they didn't have in the Articles of Confederation. And that is significant here too. So some of the compromises at this convention, we're going to have equal representation in a legislature that is the people's house. But we're going to have a Senate that is an upper chamber that is going to be elected by state legislatures and not by individuals, by the will of the people. So the House of Representatives would be elected and the districts would be determined by population, but the Senate is going to be equal representation. Every state is going to have 2 senators, and that stands to this day. Now the House has changed since 1939, I believe, when they added House seats in order to get to the 435 number. But every House district is equal, and that's why we revisit that every 10 years to redistrict and reapportion those House seats, and then redistrict those district lines in order to make sure that every district is equal in terms of the number of people represented by that House district. So that's an important point to make here. We also have we are going from a direct election of the president to not direct election, but election by electoral college. And so the people will elect state legislators that will then choose who the electors are from their state to then go to the Electoral College, and they will select the president. So it's more likely to say the Electoral College selects the president than to say the Electoral College elects the president, because it is a selection process and not an election. Yes, they have to get to 270 electoral votes, but how they do that is more of a selection. Now today, we still have the Electoral College, but it is through the electors in each state, for the most part, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska. We have the state, the way that the state goes in terms of the popular vote tends to be the Electoral College vote. With Maine and Nebraska, it's by district itself. But we'll get into more of that. You don't have to worry about that now. We'll get into more of the Electoral College later. Okay, so another item that was compromised at the Constitutional Convention was this idea of re-election. And what are we going to do with individuals either in the legislature or in the presidency, in the executive branch? And so there were some options that were thrown out there, a 7-year term versus a life term. And they ended up compromising with a 4-year term. And for the presidency, it is a 4-year term. House members, it's 2. Senators, it's 6. And unlimited re-election. You can run for as many times as you want to. Now, today, we have the 22nd Amendment, 2 terms. And the 22nd Amendment says that you can either serve 2 full 4-year terms or 10 years if you've taken office due to an assassination of the president or something like that. The president resigns or steps down. And so that is a little different than what we see here. But at the convention, the idea was we're going to give the president a 4-year term. They can run for re-election as many times as they want to, but they serve for 4 years. For the Supreme Court, we are not going to have the Senate choose them. We're going to have the president choose them and the Senate confirm them. So the Senate is going to confirm all nominees to the cabinet of the president, but also to the Supreme Court. And so the president nominates a Supreme Court justice, and the Senate will then approve up or down whether they approve or disapprove of that nominee. And the Senate has done both, has approved much more than they've not approved, but they have not approved some candidates. That is, again, one of those Constitutional Convention compromises. And then one more, looking here, is the idea that the Supreme Court justices would serve for life. So they're not going to be on staggered terms or anything like that. They serve for life. And so there's a lot of controversy about whether they should, serving into their 80s in the Supreme Court. But the idea is that was one of the constitutional compromises, was that the Supreme Court members, once they are confirmed by the Senate, would serve for life. So some important aspects here that we see. Again, we have popular majorities that are elected by the House of Representatives. We have the Senate elected by state legislatures or selected by state legislatures. We have the president elected or selected by the Electoral College, which is made up of nominees by state legislators. We have judicial review, this idea of determining whether a law is unconstitutional or not by the Supreme Court, and a lot of checks and balances that are taking place. So we're going to see a lot of these shake out. We'll look much more at federalism in Chapter 3. We have a whole section on federalism in Chapter 3, looking at the separation of powers and checks and balances. Coming up here. And the idea is these were important compromises that were being made at the Constitutional Convention in order to bring all of the states on board. So they borrowed from the Virginia plan in terms of a bicameral legislature. They borrowed from the House being directly elected by the people based on population. They had the New Jersey plan, which basically said every state gets an equal number of senators, being 2. They looked at the 3/5 compromise, which essentially counted all slaves as 3/5 of a person at that time, versus not counting them at all or counting them as one person. That compromise was known as the 3/5 compromise. And then the Connecticut compromise, looking at this Electoral College for the president, this combination of House and Senate, a bicameral legislature, and justices that are nominated by the president, confirmed by the court, and they serve lifelong terms. So, what's the problem? Sounds like it's all coming together quite nicely, right? Here was James Madison's conundrum. This was the idea that he was trying to give government enough power to maintain order, but didn't want the government to have so much power that then it hurt the will of the people. And that's a challenge. And we see that time and again throughout history, all the way up to, from the founders, framers, all the way up to today. This is a constant ebb and flow, a balancing act between the power of government, the power of those elected leaders in government, and the power of the people. And so we see this time and again. Now, Federalists were all on board. The idea of ratify this Constitution, let's get moving. And so the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, were all about getting people to support or ratify or adopt this new Constitution. Anti-Federalists said, wait a minute, not so fast. And this is Sam Adams, and you're looking at Patrick Henry and George Mason, that said, wait a minute, we're really worried about a strong central government here. This is a real problem. Why are we doing this? And aren't we going to make the government too strong? What happened to the whole idea of us being our free and independent states that are coming together as a confederation? We know that doesn't work because of Shays' Rebellion, but we still want to have state power. We still want to be able to pass our own laws. And so, and we're really worried that the central government's going to become so powerful that it's going to overcome the will of the people. And we don't want the people to suffer as a result of this strong central government. And so the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, become the result of this anti-federalist concern. And so the Bill of Rights, Madison says, we don't want to call for another convention. We don't want to go back to the drawing board because you know what happened last time? We called a convention and we ended up throwing the whole thing out with the Articles of Confederation. We don't want to do that again. We want to focus on amending this Constitution. Let's ratify it and let's amend it with 12 amendments. Ultimately, it would be 10, but with 12 amendments that we could then ratify or amend to the Constitution to strengthen the power of individuals, the power of individuals and states, so that the central government would have power, but we would have that balancing act, as I talked about, that real conundrum Madison was dealing with. And he's drawing on all of the philosophers and influencers that he's read about in Europe and elsewhere in terms of how do we kind of carry this out. Now, there's a lot of other rights that are protected in the Constitution, and I'm not going to go into these in great detail, but it's important to keep in mind that these were in the Constitution already, even before the Bill of Rights was added or amended with those 10 amendments to the Constitution. Writ of habeas corpus, the idea that I need to know what I'm being charged with. I need to be brought up on charges fairly quickly and know what I'm being accused of. That was a problem that the British government had with that the colonists had with the British government, and was part of the deal breaker that led to the Revolution. Many of them being arrested and not knowing what they're being charged with, being thrown into prison, and this idea, Bill of Attainder, large groups of people that are being punished, ex post facto laws, not knowing after the fact that everybody who is wearing a white T-shirt today is going to be arrested. Well, I didn't know that when I put on the white T-shirt this morning. That kind of thing. Trial by jury was an important aspect that was in the Constitution already, as well as privileges and immunities, this idea of different states honoring the privileges and immunities of other states to make sure that the laws are fair and equitable in terms of citizens going from one state to another. Not having a religious test for office, for elective office. You don't have to be a member of a religion or any religion in order to be an elected official in American government. And then to protect contracts. This was important because business, interstate commerce, was really critical here, and the key to the growth of the country. So by protecting contracts, specifically in the Constitution, it is going to help businesses as they cross state lines and go from one state to another. Now, it doesn't mean they're still not going to have to follow the laws and regulations of that state, but it does mean that they are going to protect those contracts in terms of agreements that are being made. So ratification came down this way. Delaware was the first, Rhode Island the last, and they did ultimately ratify the Constitution and with a promise of the Bill of Rights. Virginia and New York would get on board once Madison signed on to the idea of proposing a Bill of Rights after the Constitution was ratified, which he did. He held to his word on that one. And again, 10 of those 12 became the Bill of Rights that we have today. There's Maryland, April 28th. 1788, when they ratified right after Massachusetts, right before South Carolina. So the 10 amendments to the Constitution are the Bill of Rights that we know today, and these were from the Anti-Federalists and Madison working together to find negotiation, to find compromise in terms of protecting the rights of the people, as well as you see down there in the 10th Amendment, protecting the power of the states. So whether it's freedom of speech, right to bear arms, search and seizure in the 4th Amendment, the right to remain silent that we know from the 5th Amendment, the right to civil jury trials in civil and criminal cases, as well as the rights of the people, kind of a generic in the 9th Amendment, but also the rights of states, any power not designated in the Constitution as a power of the national government. If it is not specifically designated as a power of the federal government, it should revert to the states. That's the 10th Amendment, the idea that the power should go back to the states in that regard. And that is where those 10 amendments come from. They come from the power given to it by the founders and framers, the ratifiers of those of the Constitution ultimately, that would then approve those amendments to the Constitution through the House and Senate, and that process continues even today. The idea in terms of that taking place. Factions. Again, there's a really great video on this. If you click on the in the Google Slides in the chapter notes, if you click on Federalist number 10 or you search on Federalist number 10, there's a really good here, really good one here talking about Federalist number 10. We'll look at Federalist number 10. It is a document we will take a closer look at here shortly. But the idea is that we're going to try and control factions through all of those things we talked about: separation of powers, checks and balances, the Bill of Rights. All of these things are going to help limit the power of special interests, the power of interest groups that are going to have more voice than the people. And that was really the concern that the founders and framers had, was that they were going to be blindsided by these people who had the elected officials' ear more so than the people who were farmers at the time and weren't necessarily going to Washington to protest or to petition their government. And so factions are going to be limited by a lot of the the tools that are put in place by Madison in the Constitution. And that includes that idea of pluralism, this idea of national, state, and local government, but also legislative and executive and judicial branches that check and balance each other to make sure no one has too much power. And no one can control all levels and all branches of government all at the same time. And that was by design, to keep those factions in check. And in order to do that, you have to have, again, free and fair elections, people voting in those elections, and providing that level of democracy throughout government in order to make that happen. All right, really quick, the theories of influence. So this was an area that influenced Madison quite specifically. We've kind of talked about pluralism and power elite already, but bureaucracy is a good example of that. Of the structure of doing things. Now, Marxism theory, the Marxism theory of influence we see in things like Social Security or in healthcare, Obamacare, for instance. People would say, "Oh, it's Marxist," but is the idea of kind of leveling resources or finding ways to provide more equitable resources for people. Examples of unemployment benefits or food stamps would be a theory of influence that is, and that's not to say that we are a Marxist government. That's to say that it isn't a theory of influence that has influenced some of the legislation that has been passed over the 250 years we've been around. The bureaucracy is the same. We have a way of doing things. We have a structure. We have a process. We have procedures. When laws are passed and regulations are then approved, we have hearings. We have proposed markups of regulations to those hearings. All of that following a very bureaucratic structure. That coming from the bureaucracy theory of influence in that regard. The power elite or the elite democracy we talked about before. The idea that powerful business leaders or wealthy individuals have elected officials' ears so that they can influence them is that awesome power that we look at there. We've had many of those people nominated to different positions of authority in office. in order to do that. And I mentioned the Elon Musk example, but another one during Vietnam was the president of Ford Motor Company became the Secretary of Defense, and in order to try and help provide what he knew about running a company to help winning a war. And that's a theory of influence that we see significantly. And then pluralism, this idea that we have many governments throughout the country, to the tune of thousands of local governments and 50 state governments and a national government that is broke up into different branches, all to prevent these factions from gaining too much power, right? So does it work today? Remains to be seen. In some ways, yes. In some ways, we've got some work to do, right? But that's the beauty of a constitutional democracy, and that's what the founders and framers expected, was that it would have its challenges, it would have its accomplishments, and with that, you would have to pick and choose and make good decisions to help individuals along the way to improve our government as we move forward. All right. Federalist 51 talks about those separate powers and that checks and balances, which we look at here. This idea of the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, the judicial branch interpreting those laws, and then checks and balances on each other. This idea that the legislative branch can deny a confirmation to the court to check their power. The president can nominate a different judge than other people may want in order to check the balance of the court. But the court can also declare presidential acts and orders or laws that Congress passes to be unconstitutional. And so those checks and balances are at play in keeping each branch equal, and an equal and fair representation of that government as part of that constitutional democracy we see today. Okay, we have a lot of problems. We know that from Shays' Rebellion. We have a lot of problems. We had more, though, under the Articles of Confederation, and we can see that this Congress, this Constitution, is not without its challenges, but does have methods for us to fix it, to work on it. And we're going to see a lot more of that in Chapter 2 as we move forward. We're going to see a lot more of that in Chapter 2 in terms of the in terms of how we go about changing it, how we go about using those tools that the founders and framers have given us to make a better, more perfect union. All right, a couple of questions we have here, and then we'll wrap it up. What does a constitutional democracy require? And the answer is D. It does require active participation. It does require faith in human enterprise and skepticism of leaders. That is really important here. Given conditions, which of the following nations would not be a democracy? Yeah, this one would be really hard. If you had widespread poverty, it would be very hard for people to vote, to have free and fair elections. Many of them struggling just to get access to food, let alone you're not going to have a lot of people voting in that because they're trying to survive, right? Overlapping associations, we see that with factions. One that's very large, we see that in a country of 330 million people. One that has democratic consensus, well, free and fair elections give us that. But one with widespread poverty would be harder to conduct a full constitutional democracy in that respect. All right, the next question. The Articles of Confederation was blank. A, a strong government. B, the way Britain ruled the colonies. C, a loose friendship between the original states. Or D, made up of a strong president and legislature, but no judiciary. And this is the Articles of Confederation, not the Constitution. So the Articles were a loose friendship between the original states because that was part of the problem, was that they weren't strong enough to maintain that national government power of an army or a navy to defend itself. And that was a huge problem that was exacerbated with the Shays' Rebellion. That really brought everything to light. All right, which compromise was between the North and South in drafting the new Constitution? Was it A, the Virginia Plan, B, the New Jersey Plan, C, the Connecticut Compromise, or D, the Three-Fifths Compromise? Yeah, and if you remember, A was the Virginia Plan was the House was going to be voted on by population. So it would be by population that those districts would be created. The New Jersey plan created an equitable Senate made up of 2 senators from every state. And the Connecticut Compromise included the Electoral College, and it included justices that are nominated for life by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But the 3/5 Compromise was the compromise between the North and South that gave the Southerners the ability to count slaves as part of their numbers for the House of Representatives, but they couldn't. But this was the Northern Compromise portion. They couldn't count the slaves as a full person. They counted them as 3/5. So that was a compromise between the North and the South in that regard. And the last question: the biggest contribution of the Anti-Federalists was A, the Federalist; B, the Bill of Rights; C, New York's support; or D, all of the above. And the answer is B, the Bill of Rights. The biggest contribution of the Anti-Federalists was definitely the Bill of Rights. It added the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It protected the rights of the people enshrined in those first amendments, and the power of the states, reserved powers in the 10th Amendment, that any power that is not specifically designated as a power of the national government would be reserved for the states, or the reserve powers that we see today. I hope you have found this overview helpful, and that is all. You made it. You made it to the very end. So I hope you've enjoyed and found this helpful. Please email me if you have any questions on this constitutional democracy, and we'll see you in the next chapter as we talk about the U.S. Constitution. Have a great day.